Following the Civil War and conflict of the imperial period, the Roman Empire entered an age of relative peace and stability, known as Pax Romana. Lasting from 27 BCE to 180 CE, Rome had a political stability, economic progression, and increased urbanization. The Roman bureaucracy reached the peak of its height as did architecture. The economy also blossomed with the implementation of universal currency. Rome flourished. As many new cities emerged and previously existing cities grew in size and wealth. However, the peace and prosperity of Pax Romana wouldn't last, as Rome transitioned into the 3rd century, a chaotic and problematic time. The 3rd century resulted in economic and political disruption. Coins were debased as a result of resource shortage, and inflation became a problem. Many workers were driven into bankruptcy by an unpredictable economy. Coupled with higher tax, political issues were prominent, with few emperors ruling for an extended amount of time. Turmoil in Rome left the empire in a state of confusion and disarray.
Among the chaos, Diocletian rose, bringing order to the empire. Passing several reforms, he conducted a major overhaul of the military and political structure. His most influential change was the division in the empire, splitting it into two separate administrative entities. Intending to allocate power onto two individuals to reduce the burden of rule, the reform did more harm than good. The separation produced a more competitive nature between the two halves of the empire, as opposed to collaboration. Negative impacts were particularly visible in the West, since they lacked the developed cities and economy of the East. Instead of saving a dying Rome, Diocletian's reforms ingested the fall of the Roman Empire. The combination of Diocletian's reforms and other outside forces led to a population decline and crumbling economy, administrative problems, military weakness, and an eventual political fragmentation, destroying the Western Empire.
Diocletian's reforms were the primary cause of an agricultural deficit in the West. Difficulties with agriculture could be linked back to his political reforms, which improved and expanded the government. The more complicated government required larger funds, so taxes had to be drastically increased. Small landowners and farmers were particularly affected by the tax raise. Unable to produce enough crop to support themselves and stay within legal tax boundaries, they had to give up agricultural land and look to large landowners for manual labor. Once serving a wealthier landlord, peasants were also often restricted to the occupation. The government forced peasants to remain in service to the landowners, removing any sense of freedom. Without motivation to work, peasant productivity experienced a drastic fall. Devastating plagues that swept through the empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries didn't help either, killing off many citizens and working men. The epidemics, paired with Diocletian's reforms, brought upon a reduced number of operative farms and a lower crop output, severely damaging government tax revenue and general economic well-being.
Diocletian's reforms also resulted in inflation, a second economic problem. As the West derailed, the emperors decreased the amount of silver in the denarius, the currency used by the Romans. Having depleted their resources in metal mines, the empire didn't have sufficient amount of silver for coin production. As such, were forced to reduce silver content. To make matters worse, the empire also needed to produce more and more coins to be able to keep up with the payments of the empire, which meant they were putting less and less silver in the coins. These events all led to a vicious repeating cycle. People would keep large amounts of money without using it to keep the more valuable coins. Inflation rose rapidly, and people could not keep up with the rising taxes, falling into poverty.
Trade also underwent substantial changes following the east-west split of the empire. The eastern half of the empire had a much more reliable trade routes, so the disconnection between the east and west left the west without a dependable trade source. Depopulation, inflation, and the breakdown of agriculture added to the stale and unresponsive nature of markets. Trade with Germanic tribes was also limited by economic reforms. Romans were initially prohibited from trading iron, bronze, or gold to barbarians, and as time went on, the list of forbidden trade items steadily increased. Trade with the Germanic tribes soon lost value, further destroying the economy. In addition to the inadequate trade with barbarians, the decline of trade in the previously prosperous north proved to be detrimental. In 414 AD, the court was relocated from the north, dealing the finishing blow to the northern economy. As the wealthy began to leave towards the south, leaving the northern territories desolate and decaying. Outside factors also played a role in the fall of the Roman economy. As the Parthian Empire and the Han Empire collapsed, eastern trade routes fell into disarray. Without extensive contact with the Far East, trade was devastated. Diocletian's east-west split was also damaging to the entire Western economy, resulting in reduced agricultural production, currency inflation, and a decline in trade. These problems all proved to be overwhelming to the West, considerably weakening the empire and the government. Along with his political division of the empire, Diocletian made a major overhaul to the military structure, which resulted in other problems for the empire. To deal with rebellions and uprisings, Diocletian doubled the size of the military. While assisting with short-term conflict management, this change resulted in negative long-term consequences. The previously discussed plagues and economic issues contributed to a dwindling population, which wasn't large enough to support the larger army. With a lack of available military recruits, the Romans had to turn to the Germanic tribesmen on the borders. Integrating them into the army, gradually the military became more and more reliant on the outsiders. Over time, almost half of the army became composed of tribesmen. Though hiring Germanic tribesmen addressed the problem of a shortage of soldiers, it resulted in an overall reduction in the effectivity of the military. Tribesmen lacked discipline and training and weren't practical fighters in the organized Roman armies. The weakened Roman empires were unable to protect the western borders, and the threat of barbarian invasion became imminent.
Germanic tribesmen were initially integrated into the army in small amounts and either split up among existing units or sent far away from the capital due to the government being afraid of giving them too much power and influence over the army in case they decided to rebel. However, evidence shows that after a certain amount of time, the government became lax when it came to preventing tribes from settling within Rome and its army in large groups with more influence than before because they had to become so dependent on the tribesmen to keep their military running. This gave way for many tribes to attack Rome when feeling threatened or wanting more power than their employers, and they rebelled against the government. Overall political instability became a big problem, with rebellions, as well as other internal conflicts. There was an everlasting struggle between emperors, with few remaining in power for more than a couple years. Rulers were constantly being assassinated or overthrown, resulting in a continuous power struggle. Proper political management was difficult without any permanent emperors. As time went on, more and more problems continued to undermine the army. Many recruited soldiers would end up deserting the army after a certain period of time because strict enforcements to keep them there were dropped or unable to be enforced because of the lack of military authority. Later in the 5th century, the army finally fell apart due to the lack of administrative control and the inability to properly train troops. Rome lost its control of its Germanic tribesmen who had effectively infiltrated the empire. The Western Empire was destroyed not by outside forces but from within. Throughout Roman territory, tribes sprung up, taking power and land. Rather than aimlessly attacking and wreaking havoc in the empire, tribes were eager to gain status as Romans. Beginning with the Visigoths, Rome was repeatedly sacked by Germanic tribes, the power of the empire diminishing with each invasion. A cycle of destruction ensued, with Rome continuously losing power. The empire lacked the economic and military resources to repel barbarian attacks, and the tribes were repeatedly entered and plundered Rome. With each consecutive attack, Rome's economy plummeted, and the government lost tax revenue. Gradually losing authority, the government would become more and more susceptible to following invasions. The cycle repeated itself until the empire faded away, and the West was flooded by barbarians.
The Roman Empire followed a similar path to destruction in comparison with the Han and the Persian Empire. Facing many of the same challenges, resemblance between the fall of the three empires is evident. All three were confronted with economic issues, internal conflict, and general instability, which worked together to bring the empire down. Rome, Han, and Persia all encountered many economic problems, revolving around insufficient tax revenue, as well as working class losing their jobs. Rome was faced with agricultural deficit, inflation, and a decline of trade, brutally affecting the middle and the lower classes. The Persian experienced very similar problems, with the economy being damaged by civil wars and revolts. The king lost money, so hoarded currency and increased taxation, damaging the economy's circulation. Merchants began to lose businesses, and other working men lost jobs, creating a stagnant economy. Likewise, the Han were also weakened by poor economy prior to the fall of the empire. Another shared problem was the political instability. Both China and Persia had a constant argument over succession of the throne, preventing a unified government. Rome was alike in the lack of unified government, due to fights over rule that never seemed to cease. A stable and organized government was almost unheard of in the three empires, which was the key factor in eventual destruction. Focused on internal conflicts, the empire became divided, fracturing and splitting into separate factions.
Rebellions and improper power balance were two more shared attributes of the three dying empires. As the government weakened, the Herbidity authorities outside the central administrative circle grew disproportionately powerful, as shown by the local ruling satraps in Persia, the Confucian magistrates in China, and the landlords in Rome. These three groups of local rulers all grew with power as the government lost funds, further fracturing the political state of the empire. Rebellions from below the government were also frequently observable. In the case of the Romans, armies would often rebel or desert when angered by the government. Tribes posed a similar threat. The Persians and the Chinese were also at risk of rebellion, shown by uprisings initiated by different groups of citizens, such as the Yellow Turbans. Trailing in the footsteps of the Han and Persian empires, Rome followed a similar path to destruction, reaching the same inevitable fate. Destroyed by political fragmentation, military deterioration, and economic collapse, the Western Roman Empire eventually fell. Degraded by the source of stress, replaced by territorial tribes, Europe entered the Dark Ages, the accumulation of centuries of war and strife. Once a powerful empire, the legendary Romans would eventually fall, signifying the end of an era.